Welcome to today's presentation. What the hell is water? What it will be like when community engagement is part of the culture of the campus. I am pleased that Dr. John Saltmarsh, Professor of Higher Education at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, is here to present. He'll be presenting for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and your questions. Please use the Q&A function on the Zoom if you have questions. I'm so pleased that John's here visiting us. He publishes widely in the community engaged teaching, learning, and research and organizational change in higher education areas, including a co-edited book with Matthew Johnson, the elective Carnegie Community Engagement Classification, Constructing a Successful Application for First-Time and Reclassification Applicants. He's also co-edited the Publicly Engaged Scholars, Next Generation Engagement, the Future of Higher Education, as well as an edited volume with Matthew Hartley, To Serve a Larger Purpose, Engagement for Democracy and Transformation in Higher Ed. From 2005 to 2016, John served as the director of the New England Resource Center for Higher Education, otherwise known as NERCHI. And from 1998 to 2005, he was the director of the National Program on Integrating Service with Academic Study at Campus Compact. John has a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm excited to hear his thoughts today that he will share with you on the evolution of community engagement in higher ed with the Engage College initiative as the current mode that we find ourselves in. John, please.
Great, thanks, Richard. I really appreciate having the time today to spend with you around the Engage College initiative. I have to say, learning a lot from the work that you're doing with the two colleges that have really taken this on. And I look forward to seeing how this develops in the future. So I want to use the time that we have today to really talk about this Engage College work, but also place it maybe in a slightly deeper context. So I'm calling this talk, What the Hell is Water? It comes from a talk that David Foster Wallace gave to the graduating class at Kenyon College in 2005. And the parable he was using was that there are these two young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. He nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and they eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" So what if community engagement and community engaged learning and community engaged scholarship was so much part of the culture of the campus that it's just what we do in our teaching and learning and research and creative activity? It's just part of our normal everyday existence, or what Eckel, Hill, and Green would call institution-wide patterns of perceiving and thinking and feeling, shared understandings, collective assumptions, and common interpretive frameworks. It's just part of the water that we swim in. In order for us to make that happen, we need to be aware of the culture that we swim in now and what we would want to change in order to move to a culture of deeper community engagement. And I want to be clear, when I'm talking about community engagement, I mean something really specific. We could draw here from the Carnegie classification definition of community engagement, where it talks about mutually beneficial creation and exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. That's clearly what I'm talking about. We could go a little bit deeper and talk about mutual respect and shared authority, the co-creation of goals and outcomes. I think in many ways, it doesn't really matter what we call it. What matters is what its characteristics are. And two in particular is that it's fundamentally transdisciplinary work, where knowledge transcends the disciplines. And it transcends the college, it transcends the university. In other words, there are knowledge assets which are outside the university. And so in doing transdisciplinary work, we bring those knowledge assets together with the knowledge assets in the university. And because it's transdisciplinary, it's fundamentally asset-based. And that means drawing on the knowledge, the skills, the experiences of our community partners and also our students. So it's transdisciplinary, asset-based. And if we think about this in terms of, again, sort of these qualities, work recently done by Andy Furco and Lynn Blanchard says that really what we should be paying attention to are the standards and values that define community engaged scholarship, which they talk about as participatory practices, reciprocity, co-construction, democratic practices, shared authority, and shared resources. The theory of change behind the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification is that to achieve the classification, in other words, to institutionalize community engagement, it means that it has to be embedded in the academic culture of the campus. It has to be deep and pervasive in student learning and in faculty work across the faculty roles, so in teaching, in research, and in service. And it has to be embedded in the core functions of the university. And I think of this as being the function of generating and disseminating knowledge. So we might say that it has to be in the epistemic culture of the campus. And engagement reinforces an examination of questions of epistemology. How do we know what we know? How is knowledge constructed? Who has knowledge? Whose knowledge is excluded? And what's considered legitimate knowledge? So if we think about this, starting with the kind of epistemic core, when we think about these questions of what is knowledge, how is it constructed, then we can also think about how does knowledge get organized in the curriculum and in our disciplines. And then we can think about how does that knowledge get delivered in our teaching and learning and our pedagogical practices. We can also think about how that knowledge then gets discovered in terms of research and the knowledge creation and dissemination. And then we can also think about, an outside circle around all of that, which is the institutional environment. In other words, what is the institutional culture, the structures, the policies that support all of these other layers and surround in many fundamental ways this core epistemological culture? And I want to also just stress too that when I'm thinking about how these different pieces are connected to epistemology, I want to emphasize the connection between epistemology and pedagogy. In other words, faculty epistemology fundamentally shapes their teaching and learning practices. And I emphasize this in particular because of the Engaged Learning Initiative at Cornell. So how do we get from where we are, the water that we're swimming in, to community engagement as the epistemic culture of the campus? Well, historically, and I mean that in the last 30 years in the current community engagement movement, the strategies have really focused on one, through individual faculty, through curriculum development grants, faculty professional development, to build the capacity of faculty in order to be able to deliver high quality community engagement courses. And then in the early 2000s, a new kind of initiative came around, which was called the Engaged Department work. And the idea was that instead of focusing only on individual faculty, what if there was a focus on the unit where the faculty were associated in their departments? And so how could a department take on the work of engagement, not only in terms of building faculty capacity, but thinking strategically, building the kind of infrastructure needed to support it, thinking through learning outcomes across the curriculum, thinking through the leadership and what the role that the chair plays in advancing community engagement. And then there was also a movement largely represented by the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification but really pushed for by campus leaders around institution-wide engagement. This idea that the entire institution would be aligned around its engagement strategies, and that there would be infrastructure to support that kind of institution-wide engagement. So we've seen a number of sort of developments over the year, but to build the community engagement work into the core culture of the campus, into the work of the faculty, and into student learning, it became really apparent that the faculty reward structure needed to be addressed. And I raise this because we can see sort of attempts at doing this. Tulane University, the provost had put together a committee, the committee put together a white paper, and it stated that given the centrality of engagement to Tulane's, and you could substitute other campuses in here, you could substitute Cornell. Given to the centrality of engagement to Tulane's mission and to the ongoing strategic planning process, we cannot continue to sustain a culture of academic review that's silent on engagement. Now, the interesting thing here was this was being driven by the provost and a group of faculty, but Tulane doesn't have institution level guidelines and criteria and policy for faculty review. Those lie in the college. And so even though the provost was interested in doing this for the institution, the colleges are the ones that had to get on board, right? So it points to the importance of the college as the unit where we can really dive in for engagement, particularly at research high universities that tend to be highly decentralized. Another example I think about is Syracuse University. Again, another one of these high research institutions, highly decentralized. They actually do have institution level guidelines, as well as college and departmental level. And here was a situation where they actually changed the guidelines at the institution level. And what I appreciate in this framing, there's a lot of things I appreciate in it in terms of how it's constructed. But essentially what it does is exactly what Tulane was saying needed to be done. In other words, it is no longer silent on engagement. It very clearly states that even though there are longstanding traditions of scholarship at the university that will be recognized, that the university also wants to recognize publicly engaged scholarship. So it names it, it defines it, it lays it out, it says this is really important to us. It's no longer silent on engagement. The interesting thing here was that even though there were institution level guidelines, and it clearly puts community engagement right in the center of those guidelines, this was never driven down to the college level. So even though it remains in the institution level guidelines, it hasn't really gotten into the culture of the institution because it hasn't reached down deeper, essentially to where faculty live in the college and in the departments. So I say all of that to say that in terms of strategies for institutionalizing engagement, we're at the point now where the engaged college is perhaps sort of the cutting edge of this work. And it allows us to think about a different way of building community engagement into the culture of the institution by doing it through the colleges. And I want to also say here that it doesn't mean that we don't do the other pieces, the individual faculty development work or the engaged department work. That actually work is work that can be done now through the engaged college. And it doesn't mean that we stop paying attention to the institution-wide engagement. What it does mean is that if we can build engaged colleges across the institution, then we'll have institutionalized engagement in a much deeper way. So what are the implications then of the engaged college? And this comes from a pilot study that we did with 4 universities, just some of the things that we learned from that process. So one thing we learned that support for faculty was reoriented so that it was not seen as solely the responsibility of the Community Engagement Center. I'm going to come back to the role of the center as well. All of these campuses had community engagement centers named in one way or the other. The conversation about revising faculty rewards was shifted to the college. It wasn't an institution level conversation, or it wasn't a conversation among a group of faculty. It was shifted to the college. to think about how does this work in the faculty reward system at the college level. Another thing we learned is that deans became active leaders in community engagement. And I've shared this before, that we know from other work that deans are often in this unusual position where if there is top-down and bottom-up work going on to institutionalize community engagement, the colleges and the deans are right in the middle of that process. And so deans can become the gatekeepers to this, whether it moves forward and gets deeply institutionalized or whether it gets stopped in its tracks. And what we learned in the 4 colleges that we studied in the pilot was that the deans became active leaders and key agents for change in the colleges. So they played a critical role. Another thing that we learned was focusing on the college revealed an unevenness of community engagement across departments, which was just important for the colleges to say that we need to sort of bring some departments along here if we're really going to be an engaged college. Revealed also the importance of faculty mentoring from faculty in the college. Oftentimes that mentoring comes about through a center, and that center has faculty from a lot of different units on the campus. And so we might have mentoring going on, but not from a faculty member in the college. And it came across as very important that that mentoring come across from faculty who were in the college with other faculty. And then and last thing I want to talk about here is an examination of the relationship between the college and the Community Engagement Center. And a lot of reflection on the role of the center and what the role of the center could and should be when we're doing engaged college work. So what we learned from piloting the engaged college work is that community engagement in a college is catalyzed and supported by the center. And it perhaps points to a new role for the center. The old view was that we needed a coordinating infrastructure to make sure that community engagement is being supported on the campus, and that coordinating infrastructure, the center would do things like faculty development and student engagement programs. It would do data collection. It would work with community partners. It would do strategic thinking and workshops and institutes and bring in guest speakers like today. And the engaged college work revealed that this could all be a different kind of relationship where the college takes on more of this kind of supporting role and the center takes on the role of facilitating the work across the campus. So if we think about community engagement then in a way that it's been broadly and deeply institutionalized as part of the function of the coordinating infrastructure, if that shifts to an emphasis from implementation or running programs to an emphasis on facilitation and collaboration and coordination, in other words, providing support for units and individuals across the campus, then we can sort of think about this relationship differently. So what I want to think about here is what would happen if we translated what is known as collective impact theory to community engagement work, thinking about the institutions of higher education and the infrastructure that we have. So I'm drawing on this in very particularly because in collective impact theory, the idea is that if we have a social problem that we're working on, the best way for us to actually address that problem is to get multiple players working on it all at the same time. All these different entities have different pieces that they're contributing to solving the problem. None of them can do it alone. But if they all work together, then we can actually have this kind of collective impact. So that's the idea. But the only way that this kind of coordination and collective impact works is if there's this thing known as a backbone organization. And the backbone organization is this kind of support unit. And it doesn't do what any of the other entities do because it's not actually running programs to address the problem. What it's doing is making sure that all those other entities stayed focused on what they're doing to contribute and how they're continuing to work with the others to try to address the issue. So what I'm suggesting here is that we could take this collective impact theory and maybe translate it into higher education in a way that the Community Engagement Center could become a backbone organization. In other words, it would function in a way that it wouldn't be doing the engagement. Other units would do that. It would simply help those units do that. And as a backbone organization, it would do things like plan and manage and support community engagement initiatives through facilitation, technology and communication support, data collection and reporting, handling all the logistics and administrative details. But it's not running programs. It's allowing others to do that activity and supporting them in that effort. So functioning as a backbone then is less involved with implementing any set of programs, but it's dedicated to supporting and driving the engagement of many units across the campus. So the Engage College work very specifically raises this question of what would it mean for a center to function as a backbone organization, focused not on running programs, but instead facilitating engagement across the campus. All right, so I want to get back to the water here. So with community engagement at the core of the epistemic culture of the college, that would mean that the water would have to be life affirming for everyone. It has to affirm the full participation of all students and faculty. It has to affirm a commitment to equity. And the water has to allow students and faculty of color to thrive. What I'm saying here is that the epistemic culture has to allow students and faculty of color to thrive. So I want to share with you a little bit of data. I want to come back to this. So this comes from the faculty survey done by Harry at UCLA every 3 years. We're all familiar with the student survey that they do every year. We get that data and tells us something about who our freshmen are. But in the faculty survey, which they do every 3 years, they ask a set of questions around community engagement and community service. There's 6 questions. This is just about one question. And the question is, during the past 2 years, have you collaborated with the local community in your teaching/research? The first time that this was asked was in 2004, 2005. And so the data I'm going to show you looks at it for the 2004 to 5, and then again in 13, 14, so approximately over a 10-year period. And again, you can see what the N is here. So I know this is small, I'm going to zero in on some pieces of it, but what I want to emphasize here is that we can look across all institutions, but then we can also disaggregate the data. So again, the third column from the right is the 24-25 data. The second column from the right is the 13-14, and the right-hand column is the change over that 10-year period. So this is a response. So during the past 2 years, have you collaborated with the local community? This is a positive response. Yes, I have. So across all institutions, you can see that in 2004, it was 42% of the faculty said that they did. In 2013, 48.8% of the faculty. So let me zoom in here. And then you can also see public and private institutions, public slightly more than private. And again, if we look at the change, these are positive changes over the 10-year period. And then if we disaggregate in terms of sex, race, and ethnicity, you can see women more than men. And you can see that faculty color more than white faculty. And you can see fairly significant increases for some of the racial and ethnic groups on the far right side. So we're looking at this data again in the more recent data set from 16-17. We haven't done the disaggregation yet, but the high level data looks pretty much the same. One thing that's interesting is the question has shifted a little bit. So that may shift the responses slightly. Now the question asks us, have you collaborated with the local community on research teaching to address their needs? Which is actually a better question. Again, you can see for all faculty, it's at 47%. And again, we're going to sort of work on the disaggregation of this. But I say all of this because for an engaged college, it raises an interesting question. Is there a reward system in place that fully and fairly rewards what half the faculty say they do? And I ask that almost facetiously because I know that the answer is no. And the question again becomes, how do we create water that everyone can swim in and thrive? So I'm sharing with you a quote from Sean Harper. I was at a conference a few years ago, and he made this statement, and it really stuck with me. He said, until we do right by students of color, everything we do in the name of equity is going to fail. And I want you to just sit with that for a minute. When I think about that in terms of the community engagement work, I think about it in this way. Until we create a culture of community engaged learning and scholarship focused on epistemic equity, in which faculty and students of color can thrive, then everything we do in the name of engaged learning or democratic engagement or full participation or community impact, diversity inclusion is going to fail. And so I want to think about how an engaged college might embrace a kind of vision around a commitment to what we might call epistemic equity. And I know there's a lot on this slide, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. But if we think about a commitment to epistemic equity, we would be committed to examining and responding to the impact that college systems have on privileging whose knowledge is valued, what research is legitimized, and who gets to participate in the creation and spread of knowledge. So at the end of his graduation speech at Kenyon, Wallace elaborated on his water parable. And he said the point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and to talk about. What is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight, all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. And so I just want to think about this in terms of the engaged college work, that the real value of engaged learning has everything to do with knowledge that's created in partnership with collaborators to address social issues. And I would argue even existential issues that can't be addressed, never mind solved, in the isolation of disciplines or without the knowledge assets of those outside the academy. This kind of education, which is what Cornell is striving for, when it becomes what is real and essential to the point where engagement is hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that's when we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is engagement. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John. I wish we could hear the collective applause. That was a wonderful presentation. And it looks like we have about 15 minutes. And I should mention to participants that are attending that John has agreed to also stay a little bit extra time. So we might finish this around 2:50-ish. Please post your questions in the Q&A and we'll go through them and John can respond. Already someone's clapping in the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, let's have some conversation though. So how about some insights, thoughts that you have? Love to hear them.
So one question, John, is how do we understand the role of community partners in the Engaged College Initiative?
That's a big question. So I think it's really in terms of the relationship that the college is established with the partners and the degree to which they're brought to the table, right? So I think with any kind of initiative like this, the partners have to be there from the beginning and have to be shaping this from the beginning. So I don't know exactly what that looks like in the engaged college work at Cornell, but my sense is just because of the sort of deep work that you've been doing over a long period of time, that I suspect that you have the kind of relationship with your partners where it's not an issue or even a question that they're brought to the table from the beginning. And that it shaped fundamentally their partnership and their perspectives shape the work.
So a related question is, do you have any examples from your work or with institutions that have received the Carnegie classification of how community expertise is valued by academia?
Sure, from the community engagement classification, you have to provide evidence for that. And it looks like a lot of different things and often a lot of different things going on at the same time. So it's making sure that you have ongoing sort of stakeholder assessment, that community partners have a way to evaluate what's going on in terms of the university's work in communities. It has to do with community partners being fundamentally a part of curriculum redesign and how courses are taught. And it has to do with making sure that community partners are adequately compensated for the work that they're doing. If they're contributing to learning and they're part of the teaching and learning process, that there's some way that their labor is acknowledged. And we see all of that in the Carnegie classification, and we see it at a lot of different institutions. So hope that sort of gets to that question.
Yeah, and I, having recently received reclassification at Cornell, I know we had to provide Carnegie with partners' contact information,
Right.
and you actually reached out to them to talk about the level of engagement and the quality of engagement with partners. So I appreciated that. That was an addition, I think, to the.
That was new in the last cycle, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Another question that came across is, you've mentioned mentoring several times in the previous presentation and now. How might we intentionally incorporate peer, staff, faculty, and community mentors in this work?
So I was talking about it in terms of faculty mentors, but I think we should be thinking about it as sort of all different positions. And in terms of the faculty piece that I was talking about, the key was that the closer that the faculty who are doing the mentoring are to the faculty that they're mentoring, the better, right? Because you're more attuned to the culture that those faculty are working in. And the other part I just want to sort of point out in terms of the mentoring piece, mentoring can look really different in terms of how the mentor approaches it. And what I mean by that, the mentor can approach it in a faculty context as saying, here's what you're going to need to do in order to be successful. And that may not actually meet the needs of the faculty member. This goes back to that kind of thriving piece that I was talking about. And mentoring can also be done in a way as terms of, here's how to do the kind of engaged scholarship that you really want to do, and at the same time navigate the system that you're in. Because the system may not be completely hospitable to that, but there are ways to navigate it, and I can help you do that, right? So those are different ways of sort of approaching it. And I think the second, in terms of really helping think through the navigating piece, is really important. But again, you have to be close to the culture to be able to do that. Like I couldn't do that. Personally, I could not do that with a faculty member in a different college at my university, because I'm not close enough to that culture in their college.
Thanks, John. The next question is, I love the concept of epistemological equity. Can you talk more about how that surfaces in community versus academic contexts?
Yeah, I don't know that I can really speak to it in terms of how it surfaces in community context. In the academic context, it fundamentally brings the community into a more central place in my thinking. And the reason for that is that it's fundamentally raising the questions about these sort of epistemological questions that we raised earlier, around where knowledge comes from and who has knowledge. And so faculty who are doing work that really values the knowledge assets outside the academy, they are recognizing, honoring, their work is tied to the work that's being done in the community. So in that sense, it sort of brings it closer. I do think, though, the epistemic equity work is fundamentally tying these questions of epistemology to questions of ethics and justice. And in that sense, it probably connects more to the community work as well. So yeah, this is work which I think needs to be developed further. So I'd love for others to be thinking about this. If you want to read more about it, there's a short piece I did in a book called The Activist Academic, which talks about epistemic equity. And then just to sort of say a little bit about where it originates from, it draws on work from sociologist Joan Aker and her work on inequality regimes, and fundamentally on Miranda Fricker's work, a British philosopher who wrote a book on epistemic injustice, and Victor Ray's work on the theory of racialized organizations, and Wayne Yang's work on a third university is possible. All of those contribute to this sort of thinking about what would epistemic equity look like. So maybe that helps.
Okay, wow, we're really filling up with the questions. This is wonderful. Just a second. Thanks, John. How might you answer, in this context of the engaged college, a question you've asked before is engagement for what? That is, how are issues chosen, aligned, and like towards what ends? Who may decide and shape? I suppose that's a chat version of the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it does. And I guess I would say two things. One is that from what I've seen with the engaged college work going on at Cornell, the partnership piece is really important in terms of shaping what goes on in the college. But of course, there are lots of factors that begin to shape what the mission and direction of a college is. And one of the things that I've really heard very clearly from the colleges at Cornell is that there is this kind of unique moment that they're in where there is this alignment going on. And so we can think about that in terms of alignment from the mission of the college to the kind of the moment we're in socially, focused on questions of racial justice and inequity, forces from the outside like accreditors. So like the business school talked about their accreditor, the AACSB, changing accrediting guidelines, which actually align very closely with this idea of being engaged in society in a deeper way, to strategic planning processes that are going on that can align with the work in the college that drives this kind of a mission. So a lot of things sort of coming into play, but also this deep sense of alignment to be able to move this work forward in really deep ways. So again, I don't know if that exactly gets at the chatty part of the question, but there's a lot sort of that's just working together right now. I think we all experience this in the community engagement world. There are these moments where the stars align, and it feels like in these colleges, the stars are aligning right now.
Thanks, John. Another question is, how does the broader context of thinking about the ecosystem, where the university is located, and I'm thinking particularly about the work in context of extreme poverty, how do we navigate power relationships in genuine ways?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really complicated question. But I guess I would just think about it in terms of what is the role that that we in the university can play in terms of raising those questions around power and politics and privilege and implication, and making sure that those are front and center in the relationships that we have. I guess the question is reminding me of Albert Desor's work, who wrote a book on democratic professionalism. What he was arguing in there, which is, I think sort of gets to this point, is that the role of the professional in engaging with the public is around what he called task sharing. Task sharing, and I'm sort of forgetting the second part. But what he was really getting at was the role of the professional is to facilitate these relationships with the public in a way that raises these fundamental questions around power. And I fully recognize that in that, you know, from a place of sitting in a university with a lot of professional status, we have certain power, and it's not a question of giving up that power, because I'm not sure we can do that, but we certainly can facilitate the way that we use that power. And so that's the way I would think about it in terms of our relationship with our community partners, particularly in the kinds of environments that are being raised by the question.
So another question, John. So rich, exclamation. Thank you, John. I'm finding some friction as I think about what it would mean to embrace the Community Engagement Center as a backbone organization foremost. In a university culture in which engagement is already very much in the water, I see how that makes abundant sense as the next frontier. But I think in places, perhaps more widespread, where that community engagement tap is considered for special purposes only, not embraced as mainstream, the Community Engagement Center can serve as a fugitive space, a place of refuge, maybe part of the undercommons of the university. I wonder how you would articulate the relationship between community engagement centers as fugitive spaces and this idea of community engagement centers as backbone organizations.
That's a great question. Really, thank you, whoever asked that. So, all right, so I think of the Community Engagement Center in terms of the backbone organization of getting us to a place where the center isn't the place where engagement happens on a campus. I kind of think of that as sort of the 1990s model of the center. That's sort of what we were building then. It was a really good model. It did what was needed at the time. But on many of those campuses, what happened was that if you go there now, where does community engagement happen? Oh, it happens in the center. Right? It's not like it happens in this department or it happens in this college or it happens across the, it happens in the center. And that's not what we're trying to build here. To get to the undercommons piece of this, the other part around the backbone organization is the fundamental understanding, belief, assumption, commitment that the institution actually can be changed. Right? The backbone is there to actually help create the kinds of changes that are needed to deepen the community engagement work. So in that sense, the center is not claiming itself as a fugitive space. In the context of the undercommons exists as a fugitive space because the fundamental assumption is that the institution is fundamentally an oppressive institution that will never change and can never change, and we shouldn't bother to try to change it. As Moten and Haney say in the undercommons, the goal is to get into the university, steal everything, and get out. It should be a criminal relationship. And the fugitive space is a space that we go into that we can be in but not of the institution, because we don't want to be of this oppressive institution. We just want to get what we can and get out. That's not the way that I think about centers operating. They may actually operate that way for some students and faculty and staff in particular. They may be those fugitive spaces, but I don't think we want to create them as those fugitive spaces if we're really interested in trying to change the culture of the institution. And I want to also say that I completely get the perspective of the undercommons. And it always reminds me of work that I was doing in the 90s, where I would make these statements like, we do the community engagement work to revitalize the democratic purposes of higher education. And I thought that was really smart. And then Edgar Beckham, who was at the Ford Foundation at the time, would always say, John, are you talking about aspirational democracy or historical democracy? Because it really matters. And what he was saying was, if we're talking about historical democracy, where institutions of higher education had largely excluded people like Edgar as an African American, then he wasn't interested in that. But if we were talking about aspirational democracy, where the institution could fundamentally change and be the kind of inclusive, equity-oriented, justice-oriented institution that it needed to be for community engagement, then he was interested. So I get it. It's a really good question. And these are the kinds of questions I think we all should be really grappling with. So thanks.
So John, here's a question. This kind of gets a little bit at the dissemination you talked about earlier. How might Cornell's Engaged Scholars strategy contribute or influence other universities to make similar investments?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Richard. Before you came on, I was talking with Amy about whether you're going to take this on the road. And what I mean by that is I think you should be taking this work around the Engaged College to every conference to do with community engagement, right? So the Irish Slice Conference, Campus Compact Conference that they have every 2 years, the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, the Anchor Institutions Task Force, the American Democracy, like on and on, right? You should get this out into the field, because what you're doing, I think, is really cutting edge work that a lot of people could learn from. And you might even find, if you do that, there might be some others out there who are thinking about the same kind of thing. And it'd be really great to sort of create some sort of a connection with them. So yeah, I think you need to take it on the road.
This sort of gets back a little bit to the epistemic equity issue. So another person, an audience member, I like the idea of epistemic equity, but how does engaged, how do we engage more deeply to achieve this, given the enduring reality of power, exclusion, history, and colonialism in so many contexts, where the institution fundamentally represents this history in terms of processes and systems?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that in terms of like, how do we actually make it happen? The way that we're trying to make it happen now, as far as I can see, the closest thing to it is to try to do something to change our promotion and tenure guidelines. Right? Trying to fundamentally shift the culture in that way. When I raise this question about epistemic equity, I would argue that we're not pushing those changes far enough. Where we tend to push them is to get language in, like the Syracuse example I provided you. But that doesn't go deep enough. And where it starts to go deeper are places like UNC Greensboro, where it now has been driven down to the department level. But then it raises a different set of issues, right? Because going to the core of the culture, it raises questions about peer review, who's a peer in peer review, who has knowledge expertise, raises questions about products, what counts as a scholarly product beyond top tier peer reviewed journal articles, what counts as impact, beyond impact factors in journals. These go to the core culture. I would still argue that none of those get at these questions of epistemic equity that I was raising. And for me, it really raises this fundamental question, which Roderick Ferguson writes about in his book on the reorder of things, where he says maybe what we actually need is a fundamental epistemic reorganization. And so what really that says to me is it's not about sort of tweaking the guidelines. It's like we need to rethink this from the beginning. And when I raise this sort of thinking about epistemic equity, what it does for me is it raises that question of a really fundamental reorganization. Like, I don't know that we can tweak the guidelines to get equity into it. I think you need to rethink them completely. And I'm hoping that just thinking through these ideas around epistemic equity, that might be a way to do it. I don't think we're anywhere near that now, right? I do think we need to think about it though.
So I see we're pretty much at time, John, and I apologize to those of you that have put questions there and we haven't gotten to them. I sincerely hope into this question of dissemination and getting out there, I hope that with our colleagues who are here in the Zoom with us, that we can continue to have these conversations. And I so appreciate you, John, sharing your insights with us and encouraging us to have these conversations. These are complicated questions, and there isn't one answer. So we have to do this together collectively. So I really appreciate all of the thoughts you shared with us, and look forward to continuing this conversation. So collectively, a round of applause. I don't know if you have a final thought, John, that you'd like to share.
No, I just really appreciate you making the space for this kind of a conversation. And again, I really appreciate all the work that you're doing at Cornell. So yeah, thanks. And I want to thank the folks that asked questions too. That was really great. So I hope we can continue the conversation in some way.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. We recorded this session, so if you have colleagues that weren't able to make it, you can certainly share this with them. And again, we're very grateful, John, for your contributions.